Today we're jumping into chapter 9 and talking about interpersonal communication. So we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritties of forming relationships, the positives, the negatives, why we form these relationships, the stages of the relationships, how communication changes within those different stages, and then finally ending a little bit with managing some of the challenges that come with being in a relationship. One of the things your book didn't talk about that I wanted to talk about a little bit with you was the reasons we form relationships. So if you looked at the PowerPoint slide, you will have noticed that I put forth a number of different reasons why we initially decide to start a relationship. And the first being attraction. This should be no surprise that we often start a relationship with someone, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, based on what someone looks like. And there's actually a theory called the matching hypothesis that posits that we will have more successful relationships if we are attracted to someone who is judged as being like in terms of attraction. So kind of that same level of attraction, if you will. So saying, that person isn't out of my league, but that we kind of are matched, look on a level that we look the same. So those relationships tend to be more successful. No surprise, we're often attracted to people who are like us. So that's the similarity idea. So the similarity thesis saying that we form relationships based on the fact that people are like us. And that like can be based on hobbies, based on your socioeconomic standing, based on your educational level, your values, and the list can go on and on. And then contrary to that is we often seek out relationships that are what we call complementary. So this is the idea of the opposites attract. Now, obviously, it can't be to the extreme that someone is so different because otherwise that difference then becomes a detriment to the relationship. So the differences need to satisfy particular needs. So for example, let's say I was an extrovert. I might find someone who's an introvert. They help balance out that need that I might have for that sort of personality difference. Maybe you want to find someone who is a better listener than you are, for example, and we're going to talk about listening next week. So thinking about those things, people who sort of fill a void or have a particular trait or characteristic we wish we had. Competency is another, and that kind of goes into some of the things I just talked about with this complementary reasons for forming relationships. So we want to create a relationship with someone that has a skill that we might want to learn. So hoping that their skills rub off on us. But to be warned is we don't like people who appear too competent, right? Because then we become threatened by them. Proximity. This one is very common in college or any sort of educational setting where we form relationships because we see people over and over again. So this is the idea of frequency. We're forced to see these people in classes, in the cafeteria, in the residence halls, and so over time, because we've seen them so many times, we start to form a relationship. And we're just close to them. That's proximity. So that was a little bit about why we form relationships. So some of the advantages and disadvantages, I'm not going to go into them too much, other than to bring in a little bit of data to back up some of the claims your book makes about the advantages. So the book talks about some of the physical and emotional advantages of interpersonal relationships, and this is true. Research says, and I'm sorry if this makes you a little bit sad, but there is a positive to this as well. So you may have heard that oftentimes a married couple who has been married a long time, let's say 40 years plus, there's research that suggests that if one partner dies, the other is more likely to die within the first year if they don't have a strong support system. So let's say the husband dies first. Research says that if the wife doesn't have a good support system, she's probably going to die within the next year because she actually doesn't have a good foundation, people to talk to, this communication piece, so her physical health begins to deteriorate. So a little sad, but there is a positive. So if you can find a good support system, then you are much more likely to live a longer life if you have one or more healthy interpersonal relationships above and beyond that person who just passed away. So it's important to have more than one positive interpersonal relationship. Disadvantages, obviously, relationships can be a time suck. We know that, right? Also, there's a vulnerability piece. We've talked about self-disclosure before, so we have to have reciprocity. It has to be equal, so I have to share something, you have to share it back, and sometimes that makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel vulnerable, and I don't like that. Those responsibilities can increase. You might abandon other relationships. I'm sure we all know those people who get into a romantic relationship and we no longer see them. We think they don't exist anymore. And we know that it's painful to end relationships, and we don't like to do it. And technology has impacted the way that we end relationships as well. So think about what you've heard in terms of when friends end relationships. We've heard stories about people using Facebook to change a status to say they're no longer in a relationship when they haven't told the other person they're no longer in a relationship, or sending a text message, or ignoring text messages or phone calls. So technology, in this case, can hurt the way that we end a relationship. And so that brings me back to the next piece that I want to talk about, which are the stages of relationships. So your book has a nice graphic to show you the different relational stages, and this is actually based off of Knapp's model. And Knapp created this idea of the stages of relationships, and so he believed that people disclose certain types of information at different points. So, for example, the first time you meet someone, you're going to talk about different things than you would, let's say, if you've been with a person for a year or 5 years or 10 years. And that makes sense. So basically what this does is it says, based on where you are in the relationship, sort of time-wise and intimacy-wise, what you talk about is going to vary. And so he goes in through the different stages of contact, involvement, intimacy, and then we have the ending of the relationships with deterioration, and then repair and dissolution. So one thing to think about with this is that the way that this works is it can go back and forth, right? So we know those people who have been in a relationship for a while, and then they end it, and then they're back together with that person, and they end it again, and they're back with that person. So we can jump stages. And one thing that research has started to study also is about how technology impacts this particular model. So people often who form relationships online tend to disclose more in the initial stages than they would in face-to-face communication. And so what does that do to the relationship? Does it accelerate it? Does it strengthen it? Does it hurt it? Something to think about. The dark side of interpersonal communication. So talking a little bit about jealousy, bullying, violence, we know these are all brought about through different forms of communication, often that would damage one's self-esteem, self-worth, self-image, so tying it back to identity. We know that jealousy, there is cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. Things to think about when dealing with jealousy. Positive things to do would be to use integrative communication. So really thinking about self-disclosing your feelings, and we've talked a little bit more about how to do that already, but not being aggressive when doing that, or just not being nonverbal, really talking through those feelings and why you feel them. You're going to gain some more of these skills as we move through the end of the semester, practice conflict management, and then listening as well. Bullying is becoming a huge issue, particularly with technology. As you may have read, there have been an increase in deaths related to bullying, especially that done on social media. So people are saying things, right here's the communication piece, sending messages about other people that aren't always true, they're exaggerated, but again, that impact one's self-esteem so much so that they then take that into a particular behavior, which would be to then commit suicide. So it often comes in the form of, gossiping, making fun of someone, name-calling, ignoring people, those sorts of things. So it's important that we deal with those issues. If you have children, to talk about what it means to be a bully, how to identify situations, who to talk to if they do hear about a particular situation, and doing that in a safe way. And then obviously there are different types of violence that can occur in relationships. And so it's important to realize that you're not alone if this does occur. Our campus actually has a lot of great resources. There's a bystander intervention program, if you are on campus, that can help you to identify people to help you with your particular situation while keeping you safe. So you want to take responsibility in relationships, take ownership of the things that are going on, but doing it in a smart, effective, appropriate way.